Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming on a not yet torrentially rainy Sunday, but we have a full day of activities here, and so I'm thrilled that you're all here in the building. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld. I'm the president here at the Center for Jewish History, and of course I'm here to welcome you to today's symposium, Zionism and American Jews. As you're all aware, Zionism is one of the most contested terms in global political discourse. For more than a century, Zionism has been defended and defamed, celebrated and smeared. This is not only due, of course, to the role played by Zionism in the turbulent history of the modern Middle East. It's also because the Zionist movement has been profoundly heterogeneous since its very inception. Zionism has assumed many different forms over time. There have been secular and religious Zionists, cultural and political Zionists, socialist and fascist Zionists, not to mention post-Zionists, Christian Zionists, and more recently I was interested to learn snowflake Zionists. You can ask me later what that means. Today, however, we are here to historicize Zionism. We are here to explain its origins and evolution within a specific context, that of American and American Jewish history. That said, we're not going to analyze Zionism in a vacuum. I need not remind anyone in the auditorium that the state of Israel is experiencing a domestic political crisis like few others in its history. What this crisis reveals about Zionism and what the American Jewish response to this crisis reveals about how American Jews view Zionism cannot help but color today's symposium. So, thank you for being here, and more importantly, thank you to our distinguished panelists who are going to open up session number one. They are part of a larger group of 21 distinguished scholars from the United States and Israel, representing very different perspectives. And we're all here, of course, to take stock of the movement that gave rise to the State of Israel 75 years ago. So just a couple of words about the format of today's symposium. We will have 5 sessions that examine different aspects of Zionism, mostly in a bilateral US-Israeli context. Each session will be conversational, presided over by a moderator who will facilitate the discussion. And I also would like to emphasize that on the screen behind the panelists, we are going to be showing a very, very large number of important primary documents, essays, diplomatic exchanges, photographs, even film clips that will underscore the centrality of archival sources in historical narratives. This is the mission, of course, of the Center for Jewish History, as well as the National Library of Israel, which we are grateful is co-sponsoring today's symposium. We hope that today's collaboration will help our two organizations build closer bonds in the future, and it's a promising sign indeed that we will have, that we actually do have plans to hold a second conference about a year from now in Jerusalem. Many people and organizations helped make today's symposium possible. I would first like to heartfully thank the David Berg Foundation for generously supporting today's event and enabling us to bring all of these fantastic speakers to the center. So thank you to the David Berg Foundation. I would also like to thank the members of the Planning Committee, Derek Penslar, Raquel Euclid, Jeff Eidlinger, Jess Olson, and Jonathan Gribbetz for all their hard work. Thanks also go to the superb staff here at the center who helped arrange everything from AV and transportation to catering and publicity. Finally, I would also like to announce that today's symposium is part of a larger CJH initiative on the history of Zionism. We're extremely proud that the Blavatnik Archive has just opened a wonderful exhibition in the Valentin Blavatnik Gallery entitled Idealizing Zion, Imagining the Jewish State. Please take the time, if you haven't already, to see the exhibit while you're at the center today. And I'm also thrilled to announce that we will soon be announcing a year-long scholars initiative, a research forum, co-sponsored by Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies on the topic of Israeli democracy, past and present. Finally, I'm grateful to all of you for being here today, and as Derek Penslar, who I'll introduce in a quick second, will explain, for the Q&A section of our symposium, we're going to be handing out note cards for you to jot down questions upon, which we will be circulating at the right time. I hope everyone has a program, and if you look at page 2, it'll become clear what we will now begin with panel 1. I'm happy to introduce the moderator, Derek Penslar, who is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. His most recent books include Theodore Herzl, The Charismatic Leader from 2020, his forthcoming book next month, Zionism, An Emotional State, and the co-edited volume, Unacknowledged Kinships, Postcolonial Studies, and the Historiography of Zionism. He's a fellow of the American Society for Jewish Research and the Royal Society of Canada, and an honorary fellow of St. Anne's College, Oxford. Derek, take it away.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Gav, for the origination of the idea of this conference. It's been such a pleasure working with you all on it. I'm very much looking forward to the day. And again, please, as the speakers are chatting with each other this morning, do please write down your questions on the note cards, and I believe Dr. Mora, will you be collecting them? Or okay. So please do that as ideas come to you. I just want to know, first of all, how will I will advance to the next slide. Just I do that myself, or it is done for me? It's the clicker. What? I don't speak PC. I only speak Mac. So it's not advancing. No? There we go. There we go. Got it. Okay. Let me briefly introduce the speakers. To my left, Saleh Meridor serves as chair of the board of the National Library of Israel, on the boards of several policy institutes in Israel. In the past, he served as the chair of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel and the World Zionist Organization. He's also been Israel's ambassador to the United States. And then to Saleh's left is Dr. Einat Wilf, who has been a member of the Israeli parliament, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and on the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees. Dr. Wilf has held a number of advisory positions in Israel, the holder of a doctorate in politics from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Wilf has published widely on Israel affairs, Zionism, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then to Dr. Wilf's left is Professor Noam Pianko, Samuel N. Stroom Chair of Jewish Studies and professor in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Professor Pianko's first book explored the thought of interwar Jewish intellectuals who challenged conventional Zionist strivings for a sovereign nation state, so very relevant to our conversations today, as is his second book, which traced the history of the idea of Jewish peoplehood, an American Jewish innovation calibrated to suit the distinct needs and qualities of American Jewish identity. So we couldn't imagine a better panel for our first panel to talk about the broad question of what Zionism is or is not. And the text that we're centering our conversation about here by Supreme Court Justice and American Zionist leader Louis Brandeis, who wrote a pamphlet in 1915 called The Jewish Problem and How to Solve It. Let's see if I can get this to, okay, this is, okay. I'm not going to read the whole quotation. You can take a moment and look at it. But what Louis Brandeis does in this famous pamphlet is he defines Zionism, I would say, in a rather conventional way in terms of the striving for territory. And very much in the spirit of Herzl Zionism, a legally secured home for Jewish people in the land of Israel. This is actually language taken from the Basel program of the ZO, the Zionist organization, in 1897. The question is to what extent that definition of Zionism would actually match the way my distinguished colleagues here conceive of Zionism, to what extent Brandeis's own perspective actually speaks to them as Jews, as people who are tied in one way or another to Zionism and to Israel. So I'm going to ask each of the speakers to respond to that question, and then we'll have conversation among them, and we'll move on to other questions after that. So, Saleh?
So I started with thank you and being honored to be with the panelists, and I will move straight to the question I was asked. You could expect that from a person who is coming from Israel, I would say for me Zionism is the state of Israel, but this is not the case. For me, Zionism is about the Jewish people. And first and foremost, and this in many ways, I think that I am sticking to what was mentioned as the declaration of the Zionist Congress, the Zionist program, which basically said very simply that the aim of Zionism is to create a legally assured homeland for the Jewish people. So the core is the Jewish people. And in this respect, Brandeis was very clear about seeing the Jews the community of Jews as a people, a nationality. And in this respect, I'm thinking alike. This was not, as you know, this has not always been clear to all members of this Jewish community. And as you know, in this country, people were thinking of the Jews as a religious community primarily, at least representing the Jews as a religious community primarily. There were arguments within the Jewish community in the United States on that aspect. Even to this very day, I would say I'm watching with interest how at the same time Yeshiva University is fighting in court for protecting their nature as a religious institution, and at the same time other organizations are pleading with the Office of Civil Rights to protect Jews against discrimination on the basis of not religion, I assume not color or race, but national origin. So we've been living on the spectrum of religion to nationhood or nationality, and the core for Zionism, in my humble opinion, is that we are a people, mainly a people. We have other attributes, but mainly a people. Sharing with you an experience which would tell us that this is not only a domestic issue, Jewish domestic issue. I had the honor to be at Annapolis, at the Annapolis conference. In the morning, we were gathering there, delegations from all over the world. In the room, private room, was President Bush and Secretary Rice, the leadership of Israel, and the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. And we were insisting that in the terms of reference to the conference, there would be an inclusion of recognizing Israel by all parties as the homeland for the Jewish people. And the Palestinians adamantly rejected it. And we could not actually go to the room where all the delegations were already sitting from tens of countries because of this argument. And the compromise at the end was that President Bush, in his remarks, said that for America is committed to Israel as the homeland for the Jewish people, but we could not utter those words or those terms from our Palestinian interlocutors. And if you look at where we are globally and where we are regionally, I think that part of the issue of not being able to reach peace between the peoples is this notion that there is a rejection of the concept that we are a people. So to me, as I was starting, it starts with the fact, like Brandeis suggested, that we are a nationality. If we are not, then we don't have a right to statehood, etc., etc. If we are, all the rest is complicated, but at least not impossible.
Thank you very much, and now I'll turn to Einat for your comments.
Can you hear me in the back? Yes. No mic. Okay. Much better. Yes. Sometimes fine, sometimes no mics is better. So my definition, first of all, I must say, thank you for giving us this reading. I was delighted to find out how relevant and contemporary Brandeis continues to be. My definition of Zionism very much tracks with his. It's the political movement for self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancient homeland. And each one of those elements, of course, is critical. It's a political movement, meaning it's not a sentiment, it's not a longing, it's not a hope, it's not a prayer. So first, it's critical to think of it as a political movement, as something that requires organization, political will, and Brandeis reflects it. Then the notion, of course, of self-determination, the idea that the Jews have a self, and Brandeis reflects it beautifully and talks about it extensively, the sense of the collective Jewish self and self-determination about being about liberty. One of the, I think, important sentences in this paragraph is that Zionism gives Jews more freedom to be Jews either in Israel or not. This was also part of Herzl's vision, that it doesn't mean that all Jews have to live in the Jewish state, but by the very existence of such a state, Jews all over the world gain the freedom, the ability to walk upright, knowing that at least they have the freedom to choose. So self-determination is about the sense of the self, about the freedom, the liberation, and of course the equality, which Brandeis reflects as well, the notion that equality is not just individual equality, but also the quality of collectives, that there is a value to a collective, there's a value to a collective identity. It is people both belong to collectives, they're not just individuals. The ability of people to be fully who they are depends on their belonging to collectives, and those collectives need self-realization as much as individuals do. Self-determination is about that. And of course, in the ancient homeland, recognizing that connection, that territory, it's not just anywhere. And in that sense, I think Zionism needs to be understood as a movement that has three parents, which is very popular. Notion of first parent, of course, is the ancient longing for Zion. But I find it deeply troubling, and there's a bit of a trend that's been happening for quite some time now, to try to claim that this is Zionism. Zionism, you see it sometimes on Twitter threads, Zionism is a 3,000-year-old movement. No, it's not. It is a 3,000-year-old civilization, culture, the connection between the people and the land is millennia old, but the ancient longing for Zion is but one parent of Zionism, and in itself, if people try to make Zionism about that, it's a completely ahistorical claim. Because if Zionism is the ancient longing for Zion, then why not in the 10th century, the 15th? Why does it happen specifically in the 19th and 20th? So it's only one parent. The second parent is, of course, the failure of emancipation. We cannot understand Zionism without the deep sense of betrayal, of hurt, which Professor Prenzler deals with beautifully in the book on Herzl, the sense of rejection, of hurt, that was the failure of the very sunny, enlightened promise of Jewish emancipation. And the third, of course, these are particular parents of Zionism, and the third, of course, is the general movement from empire to nation state, making Zionism very much a movement of its time. And I will just finish by saying that I think in all that, Zionism also cannot be understood without secularism. Again, part of a general trend is now to think of Zionism as something that is religious. Again, to try to make the religious longing be all, that this is it, this is Zionism. Zionism being claimed politically in Israel as a religious idea. And I argued that Zionism cannot come into being without secularism. In that sense, Zionism inhabits, embodies the modern notion that people shape history, that people can collectively organize to change their fate. Zionism, and again, I don't think I'm paraphrasing too much, essentially goes to the Jewish people and says, you've been praying to God to send his Messiah for how long now? 1,700, 1,800 years? How well has that worked out for you? And it's a movement of self-redemption, of self-messiahs. And in that sense, it could not come into being without the modern secular idea of people organizing collectively to change the historical direction of a people.
Thank you. So already I think we see a tension. Is Zionism about territory? Or is it about the Jews as a people?
Okay.
I'm setting you up. I'm
Perfect.
introducing you. Don't worry. You're the main event. Territory or peoplehood, see? And even the use of the word, you referred to the word standing tall, komemiut in Hebrew. David Ben-Gurion liked to call the war of 1948 Milchemet HaKomemiut, a term that fell out of fashion. The war of standing tall, but it also has connotations for diaspora Jews as well. So that tension between Zionism as a territorialist or territorial movement, but also a movement that inspires and transforms Jews worldwide, and that's the lead into Noam. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought we were moving forward, which is okay. Fine. We have 3 opportunities to speak this morning. Good morning. It's nice to be here, and it's great to be here with my esteemed colleagues. It's also kind of a challenge to be the last of 3 speakers, and also to kind of be speaking after 2 real leaders in Israel. And so my perspective is going to be a different one as an American Jew and as somebody who studies Brandeis and the history of American Zionism. And it also shows kind of the richness and diversity that we can all look at this text and see it really differently, because I have some, not major differences, but I think some subtle and important differences that when I read this essay, I think they provide additional ways of thinking about some of the questions that the other panelists raised. The first thing that I'll just bring to note is that both previous talks focused either on the idea of a political movement or the idea of statehood at the centrality of Zionism. If you go back and you read the Brandeis essay, that's not the language that's used in the essay to find nationality. And in fact, what's really fascinating about the Brandeis essay is the focus is not on the politics of the building of the homeland, or even on a state. The language here is home or home rule. Now, obviously, in 1915, the possibility of a state was not necessarily obvious or even likely. But I think it's really important for us, as people living when we do, not to read back the history of Zionism after 1948, right? The fact that it ended in a state wasn't the way in which it was initially imagined, and this essay is really a strong example of that. For Brandeis, the Jewish problem was framed as actually a problem about liberal democracy, and not necessarily the failure of emancipation, but the failure of liberalism and equality to be able to respect group differences. And within a nation state, when you have a certain ethnic group or religious group that the state is meant to represent, whether it's French, whether it's American in some people's definition of Americans, particularly in the 19-teens and 20s, and again today, that for Brandeis, the Jewish problem is a universal problem that liberal nation states have a hard time balancing between individual rights and recognizing collective differences. And the important part about Jewish nationality for Brandeis was it was unique in that it taught a history of national collectivity that didn't need territory or politics, but actually found other types of unifying criteria, which in his mind had to do with, he uses terms like sentiment. He's obviously pulling from people like Ahad Ha'am and cultural ideas, but also just a very political idea of the value of difference outside of your own homeland. And I think that's crucial, because that is very different than equating Zionism first and foremost with a state. For Brandeis, the goal, the state and the homeland was important, but primarily as a way of nourishing the diaspora. And that's the second point, is that when we use the word peoplehood, or we talk about Jews outside of the homeland, it's still, there's a sense that people in Israelis are doing it right, and you're supposed to be there, and we're getting a little bit of guilt. But for Brandeis, there wasn't a sense of guilt in the diaspora. The diaspora was actually what made Jewish nationality so important, is that it taught the opportunity of being collective without political or territorial boundaries. And I think that message today is more important than ever. And in a sense, we are grappling with that in the United States. We're grappling that with Israel. And that's why, and we'll talk about it, I guess, as we move on and talk about contemporary issues, but at the end of the day, is the goal of Zionism for Jews to have a state like all other nations? Or is the goal of Zionism for Jews to create a nationality that doesn't follow the same trap and lead to the same dangerous consequences that the equation of nation and state leads to in so many other modern nation states, in the inability to recognize minority citizens and minority groups, whether that's in the United States or in Israel or in Europe? That is the Jewish problem for Brandeis. And I think that starting point for Zionism is one that makes a really significant difference, is the goal for Jewish nationalism to be a model of a different type of nationality that doesn't require what all the other nation states need, or is it to be like everybody else? And when you go back to Brandeis, I think it opens that question again, that many of us, I think, from our perspective, we think it's always been about being a nation like everybody else, and that was Ben-Gurion's vision, but it wasn't necessarily the vision of many of the Zionist thinkers who came before him.
But what you were saying just now points to then two kinds of tensions, and as we just look at the paragraph briefly, where the word state doesn't appear, and he talks about a legally secured home rule, an old term that was used to describe, let's say, autonomy for Ireland. But he does talk about the Jews constituting a majority of the population. And that there's something more going on here than just a kind of aspirational and perhaps minuscule home territory. But it does bring up the issue, if I can move to the next slide, and I'm going to ask Salah and Einat to respond in a way to Noam through this next slide, which is much shorter. And the question of the relevance, let's say, of reading, we read Herzl, we read Brandeis. There's the question of different forms of Zionism in space. There's also the question of time. You mentioned pre-1948 and post-1948. So here we have Brandeis, it's 1915, and he's talking about the Jews as a nationality and about liberty for the collective being inseparable from liberty for the individual, and that the whole world longs for the solution of the Jewish problem. We have but to lead the way, and we may be sure of ample cooperation from non-Jews. So Brandeis has a certain vision in 1915. And the question is, to what extent does Zionism not only change across space, but also change across time? And to what extent this vision is really locked in a certain past that just isn't with us anymore? To what extent it still speaks to us? And I think in a way it's also responding to Noam's points about how Zionist programs, the essence of what Zionism has changed over time. And we don't have to go in a particular order, but Salah, maybe you could respond first.
Hear me now? Wow. So obviously, like every movement, this is a live movement, and there were different trends and different elements within the movement, and it has developed over the time. But I think that the core issues, in many ways, remain the same. I mentioned the issue of the people. In thinking to what my colleagues said, I would add, from the perspective of early Zionists, obviously like Herzl, he was open to consider other national solutions for the Jewish people, temporarily out of the land of Israel, because the focus was how to save the people. Because, and I agree with Einat, one of the drivers of Zionism is the 2 millennia longing for Zion. This could not work. So it had to be a homeland. It had to be with a majority, which speaks about the need having democracy as part of the notion of Zionism. And it had to be in the land of Israel because it could not happen elsewhere, because there would not be the energy of the people to move anywhere else. This is why Azerbaijan failed, and this is why Uganda failed, and then Arish failed, and the attempts in Latin America failed, because the people would not go there, because the longing was an engine, a major engine, to move the people from where they were to to the new space. So that's about this issue. Were we successful, or to which extent Brandeis's vision is still relevant, and other Zionist leaders? I'd say the following. Brandeis' definition of how to solve the problem was narrow. It was to achieve for the Jewish people as a collective equality amongst nations, and to allow the Jewish people to contribute to the mosaic of humanity. I think that in this context, his vision was realized. With having the State of Israel, with having the Jewish people as we have today, I think we have accomplished both of those. However, I would be hesitant to say that what is defined as the Jewish problem, the challenge to Jewish existence, has been met. When you look at the situation of the Jewish people today, not only that in the process, if you want, we lost a third of our people. The Zionist movement was born with the Jews of Europe in mind, and we lost 6 million in the process. But when we are looking about ourselves today, I would mention 3 things. One, if there was a belief at the beginning that with the realization of Zionism, anti-Semitism will disappear, I think we can say today that it has not. It may change nature, face, but we still live with anti-Semitism. There is existential threat, if not threats, to Israel, to the nation home of the Jewish people, from Iran, from terror, etc. So in this context, I don't think one can say that the problem has been solved. And another issue, which I think is very worrisome, which has not been spoken so much, I think, about early Zionists, is that we run the risk of collapsing inwards. The issue of whether we can keep enough in common to overcome our domestic differences is a question. And when we look at the diversity, much more than diversity, the conflicts within the Jewish community globally and within the Jewish Israeli society, if you look at the ideological differences and a situation that is one's dream is the other one's nightmare. We are facing today not only external challenge, but a challenge of not collapsing from within. And when we are looking at the history of this country, which all of you know much better than me, it didn't take more than 70 years between the Constitution and the Civil War. If you look at the Jewish history, the 2 previous attempts that we had, or experiences that we had of sovereignty, in the context of the period. First Temple, it didn't take more than 100 years between the first king to the division of the kingdom into 2. Yehuda and Israel. In the second, so to speak, temple, during the days of the Maccabees, it took less than 100 years, or about 100 years, between the victory over the Greeks and the conquer by the Romans. So we run a risk, maybe a risk for every society that has gone through such a revolutionary change, and maybe a particular risk, genetic, so to speak, risk to the Jews, that we may just develop this autoimmune syndrome that could bring us down, not by others, not by enemies, but from within.
And not just to to put a point on the question, what we've heard is that there's quite a difference then between the more optimistic, perhaps naive, view of a Brandeis and Salai's more cautious, I'd say still optimistic, hopeful, hopeful, but cautious views. Where do you stand on these questions?
So first, I think Brandeis and Herzl share the same, call it naive, perhaps it had to be a naive vision to succeed, that there is a solution to the Jewish question or to the Jewish problem, and that the solution, I must say in an eerie sentence in Brandeis, he says the solution can never be death, only life, and it's a kind of an eerie premonition, but they both had the naive vision that the solution there is a solution to the Jewish question, and it goes through Jewish self-determination, whether or not every single Jew exercises that choice, but the critical element is that the choice finally exists. And another well-known Hungarian Jew, Ephraim Kishon, I think said it best. He said that, unfortunately, Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel did not solve the Jewish question in the sense of kind of removing anti-Semitism or curing the world or the West of its anti-Semitism, but it did give the Jews finally the option to tell the anti-Semites to go to hell. And I found it as, in many ways, perhaps not the naive vision of Herzl and Brandeis, but it has its own kind of optimism. Now, I want to say something about, I think, again, the ahistorical attitude that goes back and kind of says, look, Zionism is not necessarily about a state. In 1915, when Brandeis writes, this is literally the moment when there are still many models. It's not really clear yet what is the political structure that will replace empires. There's a lot of discussions on different structures to replace the Austro-Hungarian Empire with all kinds of semi-autonomous, and you have home rule, and there's a lot of play, and the mandate system that... But by the end of World War II, there is only one political organization to replace empires, and that is the state. When lucky, it's a self-determining nation state. When unlucky, it's some other power determines the border and tells a lot of groups that don't really belong together, you're now a state. But that's it. That's the organization. So to kind of take that moment when there is uncertainty about what is the thing that will replace empires, and to kind of say today, well, Zionism does not necessarily require statehood, is really to erase the verdict of history. And unfortunately, also, like Salai mentioned, the verdict of history has been clear. Of all the ideas percolating among Jews on how to address the Jewish question, communism, emancipation, assimilation, immigration to the United States, Bundism, of all these ideas, there were a debate among Jews genuinely concerned about how to be Jews in the modern era. At the end of the day, only Zionism remains standing as the relevant idea that offered something. And again, to kind of go back to those debates, I recently read a piece that said, was the American Revolution a good idea? And the subline was, we could have been Canada. And the idea was, you know, we could have gone through this gradual process, and did we need the revolution? It's a lovely thought of alternative history. It's an interesting kind of brain puzzle, but it's not a serious program. You do not have royalists today in America. In the same way, the kind of effort to recreate the early 20th century Zionist debates as if nothing had happened in the 20th century to show where the verdict of history lies, to me is akin to that kind of question. To quote Logan Roy, I love you, but you're not serious people.
So I will resist the temptation to sing the praises of Canada. And I'll merely say, no, I'm sure that you have some responses you'd like to make to Einat's comment. I'll just ask you to respond briefly, and then I think we'll actually go into Q&A from there. But please do respond.
I definitely appreciate the importance of making sure that we don't take these figures historically and take them out of context and assume that, Brandeis's message or anybody of the most Zionist leaders' message before 1948 would be necessarily the solution. That being said, whether or not it's a state or not, I don't think is the key question. I think the key question that Brandeis asks us is, what is the goal of the state? What is the goal of Zionism? And how do American Jews think about Zionism? And the question is, are we fundamentally about supporting the state because the state is key to the existential and political survival of the Jews around the world? Or are we Zionists because we believe that Jewish nationalism has something moral and political to teach and to represent? And so that is how we're going to evaluate Zionism. And the state can and can't, could or could not be part of that. It certainly could be. I mean, cultural Zionists weren't against the point of the state. The question really is about what is the goal of Zionism? How do American Jews think about it? Because right now, I think that's the increasingly challenging question. Is it about supporting the state no matter what? Or are there limits to that state? Where does democracy fit into it? And I think Brandeis lays out that tension really clearly, because what Brandeis basically tells to American Jews and became the key that allowed American Jews, who for the most part weren't supporters of Zionism, they're quite nervous about Jewish nationalism. The key there was to say that Zionism and American patriotism are compatible, but that means that Zionism is going to live up to what he also saw as the ideal of Americanism, which was a liberal, multinational democracy. That's what he was thinking about. So if that is the Zionism that American Jews, which are half of this Jewish peoplehood, hold on to, then that's going to be the yardstick upon which they're going to think about their relationship to the state of Israel. And I think what's getting increasingly challenging now is how to square between the language and justification that Brandeis gave for the connection to the state of Israel, which was very much about because it reflects American liberal values, and how difficult it is for American Jews, especially outside of the Orthodox community, who the majority of whom are Democrats, the demographic reality, to figure out how to balance the language that Brandeis gave us. That's why this is still important, because I think many Americans are Zionists because they're able to square their commitment to the Jewish state with their commitment to being a minority community fighting for minority rights in the United States. And when that tension gets too strong, I think Brandeis is showing us that there could be those fragmentations that get quite deep.
Thank you. So we have some questions, and I have got a few on note cards, and I think Dr. Moore is collecting some more, so if you have, but I have a few. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to pose a question, and then I'm going to ask whoever wants to respond. One is apropos, Noam, of what you were just saying, but I'd like to hear what others have to say as well, about this difference between home and state. And I'm just going to throw in a question: is the only difference an army? That is that really what it comes down to? Sovereignty meaning an army, or control over immigration, or whatever. That is, to what extent does diaspora Zionism as an idea or a movement really depend since 1948 on Israel as a state with the qualities of sovereignty? Or is there still an aspect in diaspora Zionism of Israel as home? The concept of home versus state might be interesting to think about. And I don't know who would like to go first. Is there anyone who would like to take a crack at it first?
Well, first I think to me that it's clear that for our existence, we need a state. We need a state to be able to protect our people. We need a state to be able to develop our heritage, our culture, our values, and that, unfortunately, means an army. But it goes beyond army. It needs majority. It needs certain rules that Jews in the diaspora, or the Jewish people in the diaspora, over 2,000 years, issues that we have not had to deal with because we did not have to make decisions of sovereignty. But I think that with all my criticism, concern, what have you, I don't think there has been a greater achievement, I think, in human history than Zionism. I think that it gave three phenomena to the Jewish people. One is a state under which, as Brandeis predicted, the Jewish people can draw strength from. It gave the revival of Hebrew, to me, almost a miracle. In some ways, the fact that 7 million people, 8 million people are talking Hebrew as their tongue, millions of kids have Hebrew as their mother tongue, is almost a miracle to me. And I have to admit that the fact that the other half of the Jewish people cannot talk in Hebrew is reflected, this tragedy is reflected in the language in which we are discussing now. And I think, which is not obvious, the Zionist movement gave the Jewish people another present, which is democracy. Like most of the Jews have not lived under democratic conditions over generations. And part of the debate in Israel today is whether democracy is an element to serve Zionism or whether democracy is inherent within Zionism. That there is no Zionism without democracy. We had the first and second temple without democracy. So we had kind of sovereignty without democracy. To me, there is no Zionism without democracy. And I think these three presents, state, not just home and the state, Hebrew and democracy, are the greatest gifts the Jewish people could receive, and it received it from Zionism.
Thank you. And would either of you like to talk about this home-state distinction or overlap?
So I'll address the notion that is implied in that, is that do we still really need the state of Israel for Jews to be accepted, viewed as equal? And the thing is this, again, it's a game of alternative history. We do not have a moment in human history when Jews were truly treated as equal and there was no state of Israel. Now, do you want to test the alternative? You might understand why most people are not keen on that. And it's a bit, sometimes this question reminds me of wealthy heirs who say that money's really not important. So that's kind of how I view the question. And at this point, oh, sorry. Okay, sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, it's okay.
So yeah, that's basically my response to that question.
Can you sum it up in one sentence for the people on Zoom who are in diaspora?
Yes. Or in Israel, actually. That the implied notion of whether Jews can live as equals, as free people, without the state of Israel, sometimes the implication that the existence of the state of Israel is even a burden on Jews being accepted, again, is akin to me to wealthy heirs who say that money is not important, precisely because we do not have a moment in human history when Jews were accepted as equals, and there was not a state of Israel. And in that sense, I think the vision of Brandeis and the vision of Herzl has been fully realized, again, to the point that we no longer almost understand how important it is. Jews can live freely, Jews can be accepted precisely because they have the choice that Herzl and Brandeis described of every other person to either live as a minority in another state or to live in the state of the Jewish people.
So, Noam, I'm going to ask you a somewhat different question, which is very interesting. The pamphlet is called The Jewish Problem, How to Solve It. So the Jewish problem is a very fraught term, coined in the 1840s, I guess, Bruno Bauer and then Karl Marx. It was Die Judenfrage, the Jewish question, and in English it's usually referred to as the Jewish problem. For Brandeis to use that term has a certain notion of what the problem is. So the first question is, what is the problem, and then why is the answer to the problem conventionally referred to as the Jewish state? This is a question from the audience, and not the Zionist state. Israel is called the Jewish state and not the Zionist state. So far as I know, when people refer to the Zionist entity, it's usually not complimentary. So,
I was really, when I went back to read this a few years ago, this article, I think, and maybe it was during the Trump presidency, I think I was really surprised because as American Jews and American Jewish historians, the sense that this is exceptional, the Jewish problem is a European thing, not an American thing. When Brandeis was writing, it was clear that he saw the problem, the Jewish problem in the United States and in Europe, and it was the problem of nationalism, particularly of what happens when a state has a particular nation or ethno-national group that it privileges and how Jews are on the outside of that. So that, I think, is a universal political problem. He was trying to address an inherent limitation of nationalism, of nation-state nationalism, which is it's very difficult when you have populism. We're seeing it rising today as well. And I think that gets back to this question of home versus state, right, is that you can't divorce it from that question of is there a limit, right? For Brandeis, if the goal of Zionism is to address a fundamental issue with nationalism, which that there's an inherent tendency in nationalism to exclude those who don't fit the national ethno-religious community. So if that, at what point could that happen in Israel when it would then challenge this definition of Zionism as being about ensuring that you don't make the same mistake that other nation states did? And I think that's where this home-state distinction is important. I mean, to me, the issue is not army or not army, but it has to be a modest, the state has to be modest in its expectations of what privileges the dominant ethno-religious group can be. And I think as that balance gets increasingly immodest, we're starting with the nation-state bill, those are things that can push against Brandeis's definition. Yeah. Oh. So the nation-state bill was a bill passed by, I mean, we have people who know better than I, but a nation-state bill was a bill in the Knesset that defines Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Now, the challenge with, I mean, there are a number of other pieces in there, but even in that opening kind of framing of it, you know, the United States is a state of its citizens, right? And so by saying it's the nation state of the Jewish people and not necessarily of its citizens, it is emphasizing the fact that, you know, I as a Jew living in Seattle have a certain relationship with the state that maybe some of its citizens may not have in the same sort of a way. And so I think that that's one example of not a modest definition of nationalism, one that's claiming, you know, it's similar, well, I just came back from Hungary, and one of the things that Viktor Orban is kind of doing is looking at people in Romania, in Transylvania, for example, as citizens of Hungary, right? So it's sort of, that there's a tension in a democracy when that democracy, I mean, is looking at people that it's serving as not necessarily its citizens, and some of its citizens don't fall into that ethno-national group because then they may not have the same rights within the country. So I think it's a spectrum, but to me, the modest statehood. If there's going to be a state, it has to at least respect the fact that the Jewish problem is a universal problem about what happens when nation-state nationalism goes too far in terms of privileging one particular ethnic group over others.
Wrote somewhere that our demands are very modest. He wrote, a corner of the world we can call our own because, and I'm quoting him, the Jews have never been a great power, a great political power, and never will be again. So anyway, you can make with that what you want. Time is short, but I'm going to ask Einat and Salah to, in a way, follow up to your comments and then incorporate them into this question, because Salah, you spoke movingly about democracy and the consonance of Zionism and democracy, but what do we do with, again, a fact that in so many countries in the world, there are inequalities based on nationality, and the state of Israel is no different. There are Jews who have certain rights and opportunities and privileges that non-Jews do not have. And how does that square then with Brandeis's own historic concept of Zionism, or was Brandeis perhaps not even aware of the issue, which would be quite telling? This is a huge topic, and it'll come up a lot over the course of the next several hours. But if we could just finish with each of you responding to this question of, if we're going to define Zionism in which democracy is a fundamental element, what do we do with the fact that the state of Israel has a substantial minority, or is, depending on how you define territory, 50%, 50%, Jewish and non-Jewish, Jewish and Palestinian?
So I'll start by saying that I think there is a built-in limit that guarantees Jewish modesty in its aim, which is we're small. We're a small nation. You look at Brandeis speaking about 14 million. Today we're 15 million. I always like to use the data point that on the day that Israel is established, the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region is 1 to 50, 50. So what do the Jews do, deeply cognizant of their situation as a minority? They call upon Jews to immigrate. Many come, over 3 million, which is great. We make a lot of babies, and great. Today we're more than 10 million, 10 times the number we were in 1948, and the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region is 1 to 60. So they've been busy too. Which really shows you that there's no amount of immigration or procreation that will ever get the Jews out of their structural minority status in the region. And in that sense, when people speak of kind of Jews being too confident, I think it comes from a very, very low bar. I think we are built in to be very aware of our minority status. And in that sense, I also have to say that Americans, I think, have an inflated sense of their ability to have this neutral civic nation held together by just citizens. When Brandeis writes in 1915, that's certainly not the case. And if he presents America this way, he had to be blind to a lot of things in America at the time. America has this notion that, you know, people spew the word ethno-nationalism. And I always ask, what other kind is there? Because Americans sometimes say, oh, there's this neutral civic nationalism. It may be a beautiful idea. It doesn't exist in practice. We forget that the development of democracy and nationalism, the expansion of democracy and universal suffrage and nationalism happened together. Because in order to live in democratic societies of one person, one vote, which is a huge challenge, it's a real recent development, in order to give another person the same power as me over my life, I need to trust that person. And the bonds of trust tend to be the more ancient, historic, national, religious, ethnic bonds that allow communities to agree to have democracy and universal suffrage. When America had to extend universal suffrage, it went to the second bloodiest war of the 19th century and spent another century trying to undo the outcomes of that war. It's not something like America is not this model of success of neutral civic nationalism. So I think in many ways, where we need modesty is actually on the idea that there is this civic neutral idea. And I think if anything, Zionism comes much closer with all the problems to bringing together both democracy, universal suffrage, nationalism, modesty, and both collective and individual rights for minorities.
Can I just add one?
Sorry, I'm afraid that in the interests of modesty, meaning to give you all a modest time to have a break before the next panel, I actually wanted Salai to have the last word, being that as a professional diplomat who deals with these issues, I'm sorry, I'm not letting you off the hook, but Noam, can you answer very briefly and then?
I just want to say, I think I completely agree with you 100%. In the United States, I think we're much more modest after the last 10 years or so of American politics. But the important point for us in terms of our theme for the day is that the vast majority of American Jews are on the side that is deeply opposed and threatened by the populism in the United States and the fact that that myth of civic nationalism is now breaking. And that is what makes us, I think, that's the risk between American Jews and Israel right now, is that we are fighting a battle here on one side of it, and those Israel seems to be on the other side of that, and I think that's a tension that, as a people, we have to figure out how we're going to bridge.
First of all, a caveat on modesty. I think it's a great virtue within your family and within your community and within your people, and we need to be modest inwards. But we should project to the region and the world that we are very confident of ourselves. Otherwise, we may be a subject for a nice PhD, but not a reality on the ground. So we should not miss the fact that when the neighbors around us are considering what to do with this phenomenon of the State of Israel, and when global powers are thinking about what their policies should be, the strength we have, the capabilities we have, the uniqueness we have, both as Israel and as the Jewish people, matters a lot. So we should not boast about it, but we should be very interested in them being aware of it. So modest, yes, but confident too. Second, about the issue of the Arab minority. Israel, in order to be the homeland for the Jewish people, needs to have a strong, vast Jewish majority. Arabs in Israel legally enjoy full equality in civil rights. They have rights as a minority. For example, separate education system, separate religious system as a religious minority. I think that all these things should be kept, should be sacred, should be developed. We should make every effort to realize equality for the people individually and secure minority rights as part of being a minority within a nation state of the Jewish people. And we need to be willing, should our security can be assured, to have next to us a Palestinian state, which should be the nation home or the nation state for the Palestinian people. However, if the price for the inconvenience for being a minority for 0.5% of the Arab population, which are citizens of Israel, is for the Jewish people, while the Arabs have 21 states, and I think we should be willing to have a 22nd one as a Palestinian state next to us. But if the cost for some inconvenience for a very tiny portion of the Arab world to be minority in Israel, if the cost is for the Jewish people not to have their state, this is a price we should not pay.
So I want to thank all three speakers, Salah, Einat, Noam, for a very stimulating first panel. Many of the topics we've raised will show up again and again over the next several hours, so please enjoy the coffee break, and we'll see you at the next session.